Okay, hi, thanks for watching. So this is my first go at recording a video where I actually take you through a model answer. Sorry, my voice is a bit rubbish today. I've got a cold. So this is a 15-mark AO2 answer that I've written on virtue ethics. If you find this useful, let me know and I can do quite a few more of these. If it's not useful and you'd prefer just for me to go through the content in my videos, that's fine. I can keep doing that as well. Okay, let's get straight into this. So you can see, first of all, I haven't written an introduction because I just don't think it's needed. It's unlikely that you're going to really put that much in your introduction that's going to get you any marks. And what you have to remember for AO2 is that there's no marks for explaining what virtue ethics is. So what you don't want to do is a little introductory paragraph saying how virtue ethics works. Firstly, that's not needed. And secondly, if you do the essay well, it's going to be obvious to the examiner that you know how virtue ethics works. So my advice would be, don't bother, go straight into your argument. So that's what I've tried to do here in paragraph 1. So it could be argued this statement is true because virtue ethics does not contain much clear advice on how to behave. Other ethical theories such as natural moral law have clear rules to follow, which mandate that certain actions such as lying, stealing and killing of innocent people are clearly wrong. It's okay to compare virtue ethics to another ethical theory in an essay like this, as long as you don't go on about it. So I've just used that there as a little example to do a comparison of how natural moral law's got rules, therefore it's clear. Virtue ethics doesn't have rules, therefore it might not be clear. So picking up here, virtue ethics does not do this, which is why some criticise it for being unhelpful. They may argue that simply saying a virtuous person will know what to do is much too vague. So I've laid out an argument there, and then here, where I've got however, so I'll just highlight this bit, I'm trying to do a bit of critical analysis. However, I am not sure this criticism is fair. If a person has worked on the virtues and developed kindness, compassion, fairness, courage, practical wisdom and other positive character traits, there will be no need for lots of rules because a person with these virtues will know when to obey rules and when not to, so moral dilemmas will become much less difficult. To criticise virtue ethics as vague for not having a clear rule for every situation is to misunderstand how virtue ethics works, so this is a clear reason to disagree with the statement. That there, that I've just read to you, that is critical analysis. So I've started off by pointing out what I think is a weakness. And it's okay to say, I think, my view is, I'm not sure about this. It's okay to write in the first person. Some subjects don't like you to do that, but I've checked with AQA, they're fine with it here, particularly when you're being asked to evaluate. It's a good way of showing that you have personally engaged with it. So what you can see I've done here is I haven't just said, this is a strong argument, this is a weak argument. I've pointed out exactly what I think is wrong with it, which is basically to say, if you criticise virtue ethics for not having rules, you've just fully not understood how virtue ethics works. All right, next paragraph. So I'm trying to make a link in here to what I've previously said. So on the other hand, it might be fair to say that it's not easy to see how to develop the virtues. Aristotle argued that following moral exemplars, so in other words role models, is the way to become virtuous, but this can seem like a circular process. If someone doesn't have moral exemplars from an early age, how do they know what a moral exemplar is? Telling someone to develop the virtues by learning from a virtuous person is arguably quite vague, and Aristotle's thinking is often criticised for being elitist or out of touch. So I've set out the argument there, and then I'm going to critique it. This criticism is fair because it's much easier to develop the virtues if you have a clear sense of what virtues look like, but this is not available to everyone, and it's not obvious that everyone knows virtue when they see it. Now, on reflection, I might be able to make that even better by adding in another sentence here, which I'll just do now. Therefore, it is fair to argue that virtue ethics is not very useful. It's a good idea to keep doing that, keep linking back to the statement. If the statement's got the word useful in it, make sure your answer's got the word useful in it as well. Otherwise, what can happen is you just drift off the question and you end up writing something quite vague about virtue ethics. Staying laser focused on the question, examiners love to see that. All right, let's move on. However, we can respond to this by pointing out that Aristotle's doctrine of the mean is clear and easy to understand and is not vague at all. So my previous paragraph was about how you could argue it's vague. This is a counter. This is coming back at it. So I've almost got like a ping pong thing going on where I go back and forth, but I'm critiquing each argument as I go. By identifying the vice of deficiency, the vice of excess, and the mean, a person learning to be virtuous can clearly see how they're supposed to be developing their character. This is clear, but has the added advantage of being flexible. For example, a firefighter would need their golden mean of bravery to be closer to the excess. Therefore, we could certainly argue that virtue ethics is not too vague to be useful, because if someone is guided by the doctrine of the mean, they will develop the virtues and be well equipped to make moral decisions. So I'm back on the other side now, and here I'm saying why. We could certainly argue this. Moving on. But on the other hand, another argument in favour of the statement is the problem of cultural relativism. Now, you notice I'm not going to explain in depth here what cultural relativism is, because that would be AO1. I'm just going to go straight into saying why it's a problem. If virtue ethics tells us to be virtuous, we're likely to develop the virtues that are valued in our own culture. The problem with this is that these virtues are not universally agreed upon, and different virtues are valued in different cultures. For instance, in countries with an authoritarian regime, the virtue of obedience might be highly prized and respected, but in more liberal countries, someone who was always compliant and obedient might be criticised for not thinking for themselves. If we cannot agree on what the virtues are, how can there be a clear system for developing and using them? I'm going to highlight that bit. I'll try to do it with my finger. Let me do it with the mouse. There we go. This bit here, this is what we call a rhetorical question. And it's fine to use that. It's actually quite a good idea to use one or two of these in your AO2s, because you're using this question, I'm using this question here to pick up on a weakness of the argument. If we can't agree on what the virtues are, how can we say that it's useful to everybody? Because it's a bit useless if we don't all agree on what's virtuous. And then again, in the next bit, I'm making a judgment. So this bit down here. This is a strong argument in favour of the statement, and it's not clear how this problem is to be solved. Aristotle's list of virtues is of limited help because the virtues that were valued in 4th century Athens are not necessarily the same virtues that would help us now. So that's plenty of content. That's plenty of stuff. What you now need to do, having got that far, if you were writing this in the exam, you might have maybe 5 or 6 minutes left, and you need to get to a conclusion. A conclusion, I think, is really necessary for these because it proves that you've actually come down on one side or the other, that you've evaluated, which is what you were asked to do. In conclusion, I would argue the statement is not entirely correct. And it's okay to do that. It doesn't have to be a binary, yes, the statement's right, or no, the statement's wrong. You can say it's a little bit right, it's a little bit wrong. It's right in some ways, but not in others. That's fine, as long as you say how you got there. Virtue ethics is not too vague to be useful because its flexibility and focus on character can provide excellent guidance in moral situations without having to prescribe an exact course of action. For example, in the case of telling a lie to save someone's life, practical wisdom tells us this is a good course of action. It's well-intentioned, and telling a lie once in an extreme situation will not turn someone into a habitual liar. It seems clear that developing a good character will lead to good moral choices. However, the problem of cultural relativism is very difficult to overcome because the instruction to develop the virtues would lead to different virtues being developed in different countries, and this makes it impossible to say what the virtues should actually be. So what I've done at that point is I've kind of referenced back what I think are the most compelling arguments in the essay, and then this is how I'm going to end. So I'll just highlight the very end for you. Despite this, though, I believe that overall, so overall is a good word to use when you actually get into the end, virtue ethics is useful and it isn't too vague. It's simple to understand as long as a person has access to moral exemplars. Anyone can learn to be virtuous. Therefore, while there are good arguments to support the statement, I don't believe it's fully true. I think that's got enough critical analysis to get level 5, so 14 or 15 out of 15. In terms of length, it's maybe a little bit longer than it needs to be. You could probably take out maybe one of the paragraphs if you don't write that fast, and I think there'd still be enough there to get level 5. On the other hand, if you write quite quickly and you could produce that in 27 minutes, that's absolutely fine. Don't get hung up on length of essays. It's better to do a shorter one that's got a lot of meat to it than a longer one that waffles. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Thanks very much for watching. I'd be really, really keen to know what you think of this kind of walkthrough, because as I say, I can do more. So leave me some likes, leave me some comments, and I'll talk to you soon. Cheers.